So, the Platypus Affiliate Society, established in December 2006 at the University of Chicago, organizes reading groups, public fora, research, and journalism focused on the problems and tasks inherited from the old 1920s to 1930s, new 1960s to 1970s, and post-political 1980s to 1990s left for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. The Platypus Affiliate Society will be holding its 2025 International Convention and corresponding panels, workshops, and discussions early next month on Friday, April 4th and Saturday, April 5th at the University of Chicago. Please talk to me afterwards if you're interested in attending. Here at the University of Virginia, we will be holding a panel next Tuesday at 5:30 p.m. in Wilson Hall 214 titled The Politics of Free Speech. We'll be hosting 4 panelists to attempt to clarify the relationship of the left and of politics to free speech. Here's the description for the panel. From the Sedition Act of 1798 through the Sedition Act of 1918, the right to public speech has been tied to the politics of the state. The 1789 Act was authorized under John Adams' presidency as a means of prosecuting and convicting members of the Jeffersonian press for their support of the Jacobins in the French Revolution and their further criticism of the Adams administration, while the 1918 Act was authorized under Wilson's presidency as a means of prosecuting and convicting Socialist Party leader and presidential candidate Eugene V. Debs for his speech in Canton, Ohio, which called for turning the inter-imperialist war into a class war. With the Berkeley free speech movement, the New Left took up the banner of free speech as a starting point for politics. In light of this, we will ask our panelists to reflect upon the following questions. 1, what is the importance of civil liberties, especially freedom of speech, for the freedom of society? 2, what is the relationship of socialism and civil liberties? And 3, why has the left suppressed or supported free speech, and what distinguishes it doing so from the right? In what way is free speech a concern for the left? How is its concern distinguished from that of the right? More information on the panel will be available shortly. Additionally, we have 3 weekly events here, similarly open to the public. On Wednesdays in Cog Hall 115 at 7:30 p.m., we hold a reading group on an introduction to the history of Marxism. On Fridays, we hold an informal coffee break to chat about news and politics in the left from noon to 1 p.m. in the Starbucks inside of Newcomb Hall. On Sundays in Now Hall 101 at 2 p.m., we screen and discuss movies which accompany the text in our reading group. I would like to additionally mark that the University of Virginia, founded in large part by Thomas Jefferson, celebrated 200 years of classes 2 weeks ago. The Platypus Affiliate Society is, as part of its mission of hosting the conversation on the left, glad to present Benjamin Studebaker as a theorist who is concerned with the same questions of emancipatory politics for which we provide a forum. Benjamin Studebaker has a PhD in politics and international studies from the University of Cambridge. He's the author of 2 books, The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, The Way is Shut, and Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies. Without further ado, Benjamin Studebaker.
All right. Thank you guys for coming out, and thank you guys for being here, and thanks to the online audience, wherever you may be, for listening and being here. So, I'm here today to talk about ideology critique and its limits, largely through the lens of 4 theorists, Theodor Adorno, Jürgen Habermas, Raymond Geuss, and Enzo Rossi. To set that up, I want to talk a little bit about politics and what I take politics to be about. I'm a political theorist, and politics is really my category. And for me, politics is really about intractable disagreements and what we do about intractable disagreements. Now, in life, we often have tractable disagreements. We have ordinary things that we disagree about. Maybe one of your friends wants to go see Shrek 5, and you want to go see The Brutalist, and you have a conversation about these preferences, and eventually you work it out, and you make a decision together to go see one or the other, or maybe a third compromise option. Most of our disagreements in day-to-day life are tractable. We can talk them out. We can find a way together to manage, but sometimes they're not tractable. And when they're not tractable, someone ends up having to make a decision that doesn't accord with the preferences, desires, interests, will, good, perhaps, of the other people who are parties to that decision. Now, this is something that most obviously happens at the level of the state, where we're talking about the use of force, but it can also happen in interpersonal relationships, in situations and in contexts where you might not think it could occur. You probably have had moments in your family that are political in this sense, where there has been a disagreement that couldn't be talked out, and somebody, in some way, shape, or form, had to take a decision because there's only so much time for talking. And sooner or later, there would be a cost, a very serious, irreversible cost if nothing was done. And perhaps you, especially if you're young, perhaps quite recently, were subjected to that decision and made to endure it in some way. Well, when that happens, you might have an opportunity to demand an explanation for why you're subject to such a decision. And perhaps, if you are being treated with some minimal level of respect, you'll actually get an explanation. And that explanation for me is what I call a legitimation story. It's a story about why this is okay and why you should accept it. It's an attempt to persuade you. So when there's a legitimation story, the one that makes the decision respects you enough to offer you an explanation or persuasion of some kind. Now, there are some cases where a decision is made and there's no attempt to explain it. In those kinds of situations, you're treated like a slave. You're treated like someone who is not even worthy of being a party. And in those cases, you can only get people to do things if you're actually able to force them very straightforwardly to do them. But most of the time, in the kinds of societies and polities that we have, in liberal democracies, there is some kind of explanation that is given for controversial decisions about matters on which there's intractable disagreement. And it usually takes the following form. The decision is justified because of a principle, an abstraction, and that principle or abstraction means this specific thing, and that's why this decision fits with the principle. So we might say, for instance, that you should accept the result of the recent election because this election was conducted fairly, and it was conducted fairly because there's a set of procedures that were followed that appropriately incorporate some notion of fairness. So in that case, you have what happened, the election, the result of the election. You have a principle, fairness, right? Very abstract, not clear what that means, easy to argue about. But there will be some kind of account of how the election was fair that will link in a concrete way that abstract principle to the thing that happened. So even if you don't agree with the result of the election, even if you don't like some of the people who won, you may nonetheless be persuaded to accept the result on the basis of this kind of narrative. Now, the last time I gave a teach-in for Platypus, I focused very much on legitimacy as the concept. But this talk is about ideology. For me, ideology is legitimacy's other face. So there's a sense when someone tells you this kind of legitimation story that it might actually be something that could be persuasive to you. It might really be the case that the values, the abstractions, the principles that are being invoked are principles that you care about. And it might actually be the case that the way in which those principles are being conceptualized or understood really does match up with the way that you think and what you think matters and is important. And in those cases, the legitimation story would go through. It would work. It would cause you to accept the decision. And it's important for states in particular that this come off now and then. Because if it doesn't, if you don't accept decisions that you don't agree with, Well, what will you do? In the past, it was often assumed that you would have a revolution, you would have civil conflict, you would have violence and disorder if you couldn't persuade people to accept these kinds of decisions. So there is this need that any political order has for at least an adequate amount of legitimation. You can't hold everyone in chains. You can't enslave everyone in the society and deny them a legitimation story. At least some part of the society is going to need to get one, and it actually has to work. It actually has to be persuasive. It has to motivate these people to put up with the decisions that they don't necessarily like. However, all of these legitimation stories can be, from a different point of view, framed as ideological narratives. Narratives that are meant in some way to get you to accept something that you shouldn't accept. And I want to trace some of the different ways of thinking about this, starting with Adorno. Because for Adorno, we had a quite distinctive problem, which is the constituted subject. For Adorno, we think that our principles and values that we have are ours, that we chose them, that we picked them, and they're really ours. But actually, we have gone through various kinds of institutions that socialize, manage, and administer us in various ways that cause us to think that these values that have been in some sense put into us are ours. And this is the sense in which we are constituted subjects. We're subjects that have been made. That term constitution, originally, back with Sieyès in the 18th century, was to do with the capacity of society to constitute the state, to give the Constitution and to make the state. But by the time of Adorno, the shoe is kind of on the other foot. The thought is that perhaps the state or various other kinds of organizations that mediate in various ways between subjects and states are playing this constituting role. They're giving you values that aren't really your own in some way, shape, or form. So what if you point this out to people? What if you point out to people that their values don't necessarily come from them, but maybe have been put into them? If you could persuade large numbers of people that this is the case, then they might reject the legitimation stories they've been accepting as ideological narratives. So for instance, if you show people that the notion of equality or liberty that they're affirming is not really a concept that they've freely picked up, but is something that someone has installed into them through a social process, could that cause large numbers of people to turn against the system and perhaps enact a revolution against it? For this to happen, it has to be the case that the constitution of the subject is not so total as to prevent the constituted subject from recognizing the fact that they've been constituted and from problematizing that. So for some theorists of ideology, this constitution is framed as very, very total. If we were talking about, say, L'Althusser, for him, it's very, very total, the degree to which we've been constituted. So that it's quite hard to see how we could ever really break free or break out from it. In part because any process that would make us aware of the degree to which we've been constituted, for it to work, would have to compete in terms of strength, in terms of its ability to shape us or affect us, with the processes that are used to constitute us and to give us the values that we have. And this means that to overcome the constitution of the subject, you have to do it in part by constituting the subject. Ooh, that's tricky. So this sometimes causes people to go, well, isn't this just exchanging one set of constitution for another? How do you really get out from under constitution? What does it really mean to be autonomous? Is that even possible? Is that still something we can try to accomplish or achieve? Very tricky. Maybe we're not as independent from all of these things as we'd like to think we are. That thought doesn't necessarily give us the capacity to do revolution. It may just cause us to feel very small and very weak and not really in control of our lives or what we think or what we believe. It might actually not make us revolutionary at all unless we acquire other values or other ways of understanding the values we presently have that conflict sharply with the values that we have been taught. Now, how might that happen? Well, for Jürgen Habermas, there was a way that this could happen. For Habermas, we have all been taught to value democracy. But to manage our increasingly complicated world, to manage our increasingly complicated economy, it seems to have become necessary for experts and technocrats and managers to play larger and larger roles in making decisions, and for democratic citizens to defer to these experts, to listen to them, to take a back seat. And for Habermas, there's a contradiction in democracy because of this. The management that democracy requires conflicts with the participation, the equal participation, and equal say of the members. So in this way, democracy raises equality as an abstract value, and then it contradicts that value. And for Habermas, as the management and administration continues, we become aware of the degree to which this management and administration conflicts with democracy understood in close connection to the concept of equality, and therefore we demand that the democracy become substantively democratic. And because capitalist liberal democracy requires the management, this demand puts strain on this system that is potentially revolutionary in character. So much so that you get to a crisis where the state either has to make substantive concessions, it has to agree to democratize itself and its society in various ways, or if it doesn't make these concessions, it has to become repressive, it has to reveal how not democratic it is by taking out the sword and going after the people who are out of conformity with it. Or it has to succumb, in which case we get a new kind of order, a new kind of system based on an understanding of democracy that liberal democracy was unable ultimately to take up. Now, Habermas wrote this argument out in a book called Legitimation Crisis that came out in the early 70s, and it was very much informed by the thinking of the late 60s and early 70s and by the ideas of what revolution could look like that came out of this period. You had in the 60s a growing portion of the public going to university. You had more university students than ever before. The pace with which the universities has grown in living memory is really quite amazing. In 1940, only 5% of the American public graduated from university. By 1980, that figure was 20%, and today it's almost 40%. There's been a huge increase in attendance and graduation from the universities. And this has meant that a part of the population which once understood itself as an elite, as connected to the management of the rest of society, now thinks of itself as speaking for society, as potentially identical with society, rather than in a mediating position between, say, a working class and an elite. The trouble with Habermas's theory is that it never really came off. It never really was the case that large numbers of university-educated people made demands for democratization of this kind and put the state into a crisis where it had to make concessions or fight or give way. That crisis never occurred. It never actually occurred, at least not in places like the United States or the United Kingdom. So what then becomes of ideology critique? Well, 10 years later, Raymond Geuss wrote a book about critical theory, critical really of Habermas. Raymond Geuss, his problem with Habermas is that Habermas thought that real communication was occurring, that we all had the same concepts. We all understood democracy in the same way, or certainly we all could with the right kind of discussion. And therefore, we all come together to the same understanding of what democracy means, what it involves, what it demands. We all come together to the same understanding of equality. And democracy and equality, therefore, have a logic to them. They go in a certain direction, these concepts. They travel from one place to another in a line. For Geuss, this is not necessarily true. For Geuss, we don't necessarily all understand terms the same way. And that means that we often struggle to communicate. Why do we have intractable disagreement? Why do we need politics in the first place? Well, part of it is that we're in separate bodies that cut us off and estrange us from each other. It's hard for me to know exactly what's going on in your heads and for you to know exactly what's going on in my head. You might really be enjoying this talk right now, or you might be kind of bored. I can't be sure just by looking at you, right? And even if I asked you, you could lie to me, or maybe you're confused about whether you're enjoying the talk. You don't even know if you're enjoying it. You have to figure that out. That's going to take you a while. You might not be able to faithfully report to me right now, even trying to tell me the truth, whether you really did enjoy it. You could decide 3 days later, a week later, that you hated it. This often happens when you go on a date. So how can we be sure that communication is really occurring? And how can we be sure that we all have the same concepts in our heads at the same time? And what do we make of a concept like ideology if we take these premises about the difficulty of communication seriously? What does ideology become? Well, for Geuss, ideology becomes something a bit narrower. It becomes the conflation of a particular interest with a universal interest. So say that you are looking for work and you're offered a job and the job pays 50 grand. And you say to the boss, why is it that the job only pays 50 grand? Why can't it pay 60 grand? Well, the boss will say, in the labor market, this is just the going rate. This is just what this kind of work pays. There's a supply of people who do this kind of work, and there's a demand for it, and as a consequence of these natural forces, the work pays what it pays. And to ask it to pay something else is to ask me to violate nature in some way. It's to ask me to do something which would disrupt the order of the universe. It would violate universal interests for me to give you more than 50K. Maybe the employer wouldn't say it in precisely those words, but it would have something like that meaning. For Geuss, the employer is engaging in an ideological move because the employer, of course, benefits from not paying more money. And by framing this as something neutral, something objective, something that doesn't have any particular valence, the employer is messing with you. And this remains true even if the employer themselves doesn't realize that that's what's going on. So ideology moves from you don't realize that you've been constituted to you have a different concept of democracy from the state to you're being told that your interests are served by something that actually serves somebody else's interests much more than yours. Geuss made these kinds of arguments in the 80s, and he often made these arguments in reference to the neoliberal reforms of that period. So it would be said that you just have to do austerity because there's an objective character. It's just not the case that the state can continue to spend what it's been spending on, say, healthcare or housing. Well, this would be presented as a natural fact coming out of economic science, but it served the interests of some people in society much more so than others. Nevertheless, nobody really used that to do revolution. That kind of thinking was quite dominant in the academy. Geuss was certainly, he's still around, and so is Habermas. He was certainly very effective at getting that theory out there as an academic theory, but it didn't motivate large numbers of people to do very much. So more recently, there's been a new kind of theory that has become popular in the academy that is not yet so widely discussed outside the academy. From a guy, Enzo Rossi, who is currently based at the University of Amsterdam. He's only just a little bit older than me, maybe 10 years or so. And he makes the argument that ideology isn't really a question of morality, isn't really a question of moral values, but it's actually about epistemology. Ideology for him comes about when the thing that is trying to legitimate the decision creates the conditions under which the narrative is accepted. So if the entity that is making the decision is acting as a judge in its own case by creating the conditions under which its own narrative is being evaluated, this would give you an epistemic reason to doubt what is being said to you. Now, that argument sounds a lot like Adorno's, doesn't it? It's not altogether very different from Adorno's, this focus on a subject that's been constituted and therefore perhaps ought to question what they have been taught to value. Certainly, there's an argument that can be made by Rossi and also by Geuss that their theories of ideology in various ways comport with Adorno's. What I want to suggest to you today, and also in the book, is that the same problem that Geuss identified with Habermas's theory affects all of these theories of ideology critique. And this is that we often end up with too many very different positions and values, abstractions that we understand in too many different ways to unite us by making an appeal to abstract values. That doesn't mean that appeals to abstract values are pointless or useless. But it does mean that you will not achieve a consensus. You won't unite society for change by doing that. And the problem is not solved by making it a more epistemic argument. Because, as you may have noticed, we now have the same kinds of conflicts about epistemology that we have had for a long time about morality. We've reached a point where we don't agree on how to determine if something is true or how to determine if an entity is acting as a judge in its own case. And there are some situations where, for instance, we wouldn't be entirely bothered by an entity to some degree acting as a judge in its own case. For instance, we have all been subject to the coercive authority of our parents at some point, assuming that none of us were orphaned at a very early age. And as a consequence of that, we all are people who have been formed by the ways in which our parents raised us, disciplined us, taught us. So we've all been constituted by our parents. Does that mean by itself that we have to reject everything our parents taught us as ideology? It would be kind of hard to have any sort of social order if the answer had to be yes. If we have to reject anything that comes from being constituted by something which has the power to shape us or mold us, then we couldn't affirm anything. So a very totalizing version of this argument won't quite cut it. And even the Geuss argument, sometimes I'm sure when your parents said things to you about what was good for the family, they invited you to identify yourself more with that concept than really was fair. But the invocation of the family to get you to do something isn't in and of itself obviously wrong. Say you are making a decision about whether to go to grandma's funeral and you don't want to go because you want to play video games. It might be said that you need to do this for reasons that are to do with the family, and the family is a kind of objective interest that you have a stake in, whether you realize it or not. In some sense, that might not be true. In some sense, you really might have a much better time if you play video games that day. It might really be true. And yet, at the same time, we wouldn't think that that argument automatically can't hold up. Maybe there is something that cuts across the individual interests that we do at some points have to defer to, and the raising of that universal interest or larger interest isn't necessarily out of bounds or automatically illicit. I think that what ideology critique has tended to do is it has tended to erode the bases for taking decisions in cases where there's intractable disagreement. In effect, I think what ideology critique has tended to do is erode political capacity, because it has tended to erode our ability to come to any agreement about any basis on which we would accept any decision in any area where we don't agree with the immediate decision that's been taken. And that means that now, when we make arguments about what to do, we are finding that we are having to make much more polyvalent arguments. We're having to say different things to different people. Politicians get caught doing this more and more often. Kamala Harris will say during the 2020 Democratic Party primaries that she's for Medicare for all and wants to get rid of private health insurance in one meeting, and then in another meeting she'll say that she, of course, doesn't believe in any of that at all. Why is she under so much stress talking to different audiences that she has to take these sharply different positions? It's in part, I think, because we have really lost the capacity to come to agreement about values, or to come to agreement about what kinds of epistemic situations are valid, invalid, acceptable, unacceptable. And this has produced a situation where politics has a kind of hydra quality to it. So a hydra, of course, has many heads. And the heads are kind of mean. They're kind of mean. And if you know the story of the hydra, you get rid of one of the heads, you get more heads. Right? If you attack just this one, you'll find that only makes the problem worse. I think what has happened is that we have become persuaded that we can give people a single account of particular abstractions, and that we can win an argument about what these abstractions mean, and that we can persuade large numbers of people to take political action on the basis of this. And that this is increasingly obviously false. So, each of these, however, nonetheless, would be affiliated with a value that many of us would care about. So say this guy is liberty. And this guy over here, he's equality. This guy is, let's call him representation. Or maybe fraternity. Or even solidarity. Why not? And then this guy over here, let's call him peace. Let's give him a friend, prosperity. And then how about another guy? This one's got some big teeth. We'll call him order. Right? So there are attempts to persuade people that they have been taught to affirm values that really shouldn't properly be their values. You've been taught to care about liberty, but maybe you should care about equality instead. Or you've been taught to care about equality, but maybe you should care about liberty instead. Or you've understood liberty to be about freedom from interference. Maybe you should understand it instead to be about the freedom to develop and reach your potential. Maybe you should understand it as freedom from dependence or freedom from domination. Maybe equality is about opportunity. Maybe it's about welfare. Maybe it's about capabilities. Representation. Maybe it's about having someone who acts for you, speaks for you. Do they act on the basis of your interests or on the basis of your instructions? Or maybe they don't really act for you, but they look like you. They sound like you. They make you feel like you're there, wherever there is. Or maybe they stand for something abstract, like the nation or the people, and you feel a sense of identification with that. And what about peace? What does peace mean? What kind of peace? What about prosperity? All of these things can have many different meanings. But what I think we tend to find nowadays is that no one of these heads can guide the beast. The beast is pulled in different directions by all of these different demands that people make on the basis of all of these heads. And different politicians, they offer themselves up to you and they go, vote for me. If you vote for me and enough people like me, then we're going to pursue equality together. We're going to pursue liberty together. If enough of us can win, then we'll prevail. But that doesn't tend to happen. And I think this has to do with the fact that we never got the revolution back when these guys were writing. in most societies, if you get a lot of disagreement to the point where it starts to look like that, this would be unsustainable. You would get to a point where the disagreement would be untenable, people wouldn't be able to tolerate it, and someone would make a decision. I mean, isn't that what politics is about? Intractable disagreement. You can't agree, so someone makes a decision. And then they give explanations. But at the point at which we had intractable disagreement in the 60s and 70s, that didn't occur. And instead, we kept going with the same system. Now, when that happens, the disagreements that would otherwise have been ended with a decision, they're allowed to keep growing and developing, and they're allowed to permeate more and more areas of life that were previously disagreement-free. Imagine if one of those fights that you had with your parents just kept going and going and going, and it never ended. Wouldn't it eventually become an issue all over the place for you? Wouldn't you find various kinds of repressed, sublimated versions of it popping up into many, many other parts of your life? Maybe this has happened to you. Maybe you've gone through something like this. I know a lot of people have. I think that we've reached a point where it's very, very difficult to come back around to a level of agreement on the basis of which we could have sufficient political action. And this is the paradox of intractable disagreement. To act in the face of intractable disagreement, you still need enough agreement to be able to act. You still need it to be the case that when you give that legitimation story, it persuades people. And that legitimation story functions by being persuasive even though you don't fully agree with the action that's been taken. So if you think about legitimacy, there's really 4 different levels of it. Perfect, full, minimal, and liminal, as I like to say. Now, in perfect legitimacy, this would be a situation where you would never actually need to explain anything to anybody because people would simply agree with it. They would simply agree with it automatically. Everything that's done, everything, would all be completely agreeable. We don't get this because we have intractable disagreement. If we had this, we wouldn't even need politics. We wouldn't even have the concept of legitimacy. None of this would make any sense to us. There would be no reason to have this discussion. Full legitimacy is a condition underneath this in which you disagree with many of the particular decisions that are taken, or with the people who win elections, or with the decisions issued by the courts, but you nonetheless sign up to the procedures. So you think that the electoral rules are nonetheless fair, or the legislative procedures, they're okay. The distribution of power among the branches of government, the balance of power between the states and the feds, all of that is all right. You just don't always like the outcome. This is the most that real polities really can aim for. Underneath this, you get into a situation where people are still committed to democracy, but they no longer agree about how it should work. Maybe they want to change the electoral rules. Maybe they want to change the distribution of power among the branches of government. Maybe they think that there's an impersonal technocratic bureaucracy that is constraining the elected head of state. Or maybe they think that the elected head of state is a raging tyrant who is making all sorts of questionable, maybe illegal interventions in the civil service. But people on both sides of this dispute could nonetheless be committed to democracy as they understand it. They could have different visions for how democracy should operate, but they could still be committed to democracy. But they wouldn't look that way to each other because their understandings of democracy would diverge too much. It would look to each side like the other side was trying to establish an authoritarian regime. At the very bottom, in liminal legitimacy, we're actually in a situation where lots of people want a different kind of regime. They actually want something that we might describe as fascism or state socialist or monarchist. They want something fundamentally different from what we've got. And they advocate for it unironically. No sense of shame. They're not making a joke. It's not a meme. They're very serious, and they actually want to bring these things about. What I want to suggest to you is that we've kind of gotten into a weird thing where we stay at the minimal level of legitimacy all the time. We aren't willing to do the things that would escalate it to the liminal level. We're not actually able or willing to get ourselves to do the revolution on the basis of ideology critique. So we're not actually able to put the state in that dangerous situation, at least not in certain kinds of liberal democracies, what I call embedded democracies. Democracies that have been around for a very long time, that have outlasted many other systems in many other parts of the world. Because these democracies have been around for so long, there's a mystique associated with them. People think that what it means to be American is to support democracy. It's to support the Constitution. Or people think that democracy is the best form of government except for all the others that have been tried. And if you have a revolution, you're going to open a Pandora's box and end up with something horrible, terrible, something from the 20th century, something scary and bad that could kill millions of people. And that would be awful and foolish. And why would you? So if you can't move to this liminal level, if you're at a point where ideology critique doesn't cause a revolution to happen, what does ideology critique do? It destroys any possibility of moving to full legitimacy. So its function becomes to leave you in that minimal zone for an extended period of time, and to get ever more trapped in that minimal zone, ever more lost in increasingly intensifying disagreements in larger and larger areas of life. Now, many postmodern theorists frame this as if it were always the case, as if people always disagreed this much. No, this is something that has come out of a historical process. It's come out of the fact that we didn't do the revolution. We didn't do it in the 60s. We didn't do it in the 30s. We didn't do it in the 20s. We didn't have this kind of showdown in the United States or in the UK. And because we didn't have it, the disagreements that we had were never litigated. Never. And just like those unresolved conflicts that you have with your parents, they're now everywhere. Everywhere in your life, even in places that you struggle to notice on your own, even in your subconscious. And democracy doesn't have a therapist. It can't go and dig into itself and find all of these things. There's no talking it out or recovering it by meeting with some expert who tells democracy what it all means. There's too much epistemic disagreement. Who would trust a therapist to do such a thing? It's one of the things that is itself being litigated, whether there are experts who could do such a thing. It's a question for people like me, whether we actually have any kind of expertise about anything, such that anybody should hire us to talk about any of this. And an open question that we've created, that we've worked tirelessly over decades to create, by subjecting everything to ideology critique and never undertaking any of the necessary steps to actually produce a transformation in the regime. And I think that were we to try to do something like that, we would have to take into account the very profound disagreements that have been kicked up over the last 50, 60, 70 years. Very profound, very deep disagreements. And we would also have to keep in mind that expansion of the university population that I talked about earlier. Because when we have a situation where 40% of the population goes through this kind of institution and 60% do not, the ways in which the subjects are constituted is very different. High school subjectivity is quite different from university subjectivity. And when you go through the university system, you become different. And not necessarily always better, but different. And it creates gaps. And I think one of the profound gaps that it creates is that there's a tendency for people in the university system to prefer liberal abstractions. And those, I would say, are liberty, equality, and representation. People who go through university socialization tend to emphasize these values more when they're evaluating whether a particular legitimation story is persuasive. And they understand these abstractions in different ways from people who don't go to university generally. And people who don't go to university, I think, tend to be more interested in these things, peace, prosperity, and order, which are more to do with the felt reality of life. Does it seem like you can go to the store and you're going to be safe? Does it seem like your son is going to end up getting drafted and killed abroad in a war? Does it seem like you're going to be able to buy things in the store if you go? Will you be able to afford them? These things tend to play a larger role among those who do not go to university. And I don't simply mean the poor here. I also mean people who run small businesses, people who are petty bourgeois, people who are independent contractors. They're often more concerned with these things, in part because the kinds of businesses they operate are small and fragile, even if their income is higher. And this fracturing into a university-educated population and a not tends not to be understood simply as a fracturing. It tends to be moralized. It tends to be the case that people who have been constituted by the other set of structures are blamed or shamed for the particular morals or values that they have acquired and framed as the problem. For people who have been through the university, the people who haven't are the problem. They're what's in the way. They're the reason that this doesn't come off. They're backward. They're a labor aristocracy. They're, the people in the way. And conversely, for people who have not gone to university, it's the university-educated consciousness that is the problem. It's the pretentiousness. It's the thinking you know everything and coming in and bossing everybody around. That's the problem. That's what drives everybody out of the meetings. And the truth is that both of these things are problems. Both of them are problems, but we have lost increasingly the ability to talk across any of it. Because just as the Democrats and the Republicans each accuse the other of being opposed to democracy, when in point of fact, each just has a different understanding of what democracy means, the college-educated and the non-college-educated both accuse each other of being opposed to revolution and opposed to socialism, when each have different understandings of what they mean. The longer we go without dealing with these repressed problems, the harder and harder it gets to resolve them internally through some kind of discussion process. And this is why I think we're really in a quite serious pickle. And there isn't just some straightforward advice I could give you. Most of the things I could tell you to do, these guys and many other guys have tried telling people to do things, saying, here's some advice for you. It hasn't been very effective, because this is a problem of our historical situation. It's a problem of the world that we are in, and it's constraining us in various ways. But I think that by raising our awareness of it, our consciousness of it, I can at least help us to avoid doing things that we are quite confident are not going to work. Things that have been tried over and over and over again, that haven't been successful. And these I would chiefly name as ideology critique. we've got to do something else other than ideology critique. We have to come up with an order that people actually want, that people can actually see themselves living better in. And we have to be able to come up with a way of explaining that order to people, so that even when it takes decisions that they don't fully agree with, that they don't fully understand, they're nonetheless able to put up with those decisions. If you go to any organization, if you go and talk to people anywhere, very often what you find is that these organizations immediately, as soon as a controversial question comes up, fracture, fragment, fall apart. There's no ability to explain a controversial decision such that people will accept it even if they don't agree with it. Each person thinks that their values and their values alone ought to guide and direct what is done. And the only way in which this can be avoided is by suppressing the disagreement. That's the only way organizations these days seem to be able to get traction or to survive. And that suppression of disagreement is different from legitimation. Legitimation involves persuasion. It involves an open conversation about why you should nonetheless accept what you are not initially persuaded to accept. And it has a role. It has a role even for us, even for those of us who don't like the current order and want to see it profoundly changed. That's my case to you, and I will take questions.
Thank you for your presentation, Benjamin Studebaker. I would like to open the floor for questions, but before one of the members of the audience has asked me to give a question, so I'll read it off now. Last week, I noticed two uses of the word ideology, and since I'm often uncertain about how it's being used, I'd like to ask Benjamin if he'd be so kind as to comment on them. Number one, the first instance is from the interview that Amy Goodman conducted last week with M. Jessen on Democracy Now! Amy Goodman says, "So I want to ask you, Jessen, about the Democratic response, which you've also written about. For example, right now you have the Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer announcing he's voting for a Republican measure to keep the government funded, splitting from many Democratic senators and Congress members. Now you, Jessen, write, Trump understands politics as the interplay of power and ideology. His opponents see politics as procedure. The contrast has never been starker." And you write, "And never has the Democrats' technocratic, legalistic approach been more detrimental to the cause of democracy. Talk about the span of response, everything from, that golden escalator, which was repurposed yesterday as Jewish Voice for Peace. 100 people got arrested, and they went up and down the escalator, and they decried what's happening with Mahmoud H., with immigrants, with trans people, etc., to Schumer. Perhaps Goodman is implying that the activities of the escalator riding protesters expresses a mix of ideology and power. Clearly, it isn't aligned with the technocratic, legalistic proceduralism of current congressional Democrats. Number two, the second instance comes from a YouTube video of a talk by Norman Finkelstein, in which he characterizes how some Jews, Israelis, and Jewish Israelis have invoked the World War II Holocaust of Jews, but without mentioning Roma, homosexuals, etc., in connection with Israel's 1960s and beyond dealings with European governments, to the tune of $20 billion, which Finkelstein characterizes as extortion, and B, for political gain vis-a-vis the promotion of policies that they understand to be advantageous to the state of Israel. The quote-unquote, the Holocaust industry is, as I understand it, the name that Finkelstein has given to this two-pronged ideology. That is the question.
So I think a lot of the time the term ideology is used to describe something I don't like, which seems nonetheless to be motivating people to do things. And this is the thing about ideology, because it is legitimacy's other face, there is always a sense in which ideology potentially works for some people some of the time. It actually does persuade them, and it causes them to actually do things. So in both of these cases, the term ideology is being used to reference someone who is actually doing things, but things that the speaker thinks is bad, that they shouldn't be motivated to do. And therefore, the speaker is suggesting that that ought to be regarded as ideology. But also implicit in Amy Goodman's remarks is this idea that the Democratic Party should get better at ideology, that the Democratic Party needs to give positive explanations that it needs to legitimate its activity in terms of people's values rather than perhaps appealing simply to the confidence which they're assumed always already to have in the procedures. That maybe the procedures are being contested more than the Democrats are fully acknowledging or owning up to, and therefore they have to get more involved in a debate about motivating values.
Okay. Are there any other questions from the room?
Yes. I'm going to read off a brief quote in my notes from C. Wright Mills, but I think it's related to what you were talking about at the end of your talk. He wrote in his little to the New Left, if there was to be a politics of a new left, what needs to be analyzed is the structure of institutions, the foundation of policies. In this sense, both in his criticisms and his proposals, all work is necessarily structural, and so, for us, just now, utopian. How do you see the relationship between your political thought, especially here towards the end, relating to the alternative to ideology critique, and the concept of utopia?
Yeah, so I think many people have a motivation that's based on values that to some degree reach beyond where we currently are. But at the same time, to have acquired those values, they have to have gotten them in some way, shape, or form out of the life that they've lived and the various things that they've gone through. So there's a sense in which utopian values are always of the present and of reality. And so there's always something of reality in utopias. So you can say both at once. You can say that there's a utopianism to reality, but there's also reality to utopias. And for this reason, in different times and in different conditions, what we would consider to be a utopia changes as the reality that inspires the utopianism changes. I think that just because somebody can think of a utopia doesn't mean it's going to be politically motivating. Oftentimes people say that we need radical imaginaries, and what they simply mean by that is that someone needs to describe in words something that sounds pleasant. But that's different from motivating someone to do something potentially dangerous that could have costs. To actually bring about a new order, you have to defy the one that is giving the orders. And that defiance creates a crisis situation where, yes, they might make concessions to you, yes, there might be a revolution, but also they may attempt to repress your activity with force. And so you not only have to find the vision pleasant to think about or read about, you have to actually be willing to take on risk for it. And that's a much higher bar. The motivational side of language, of political language, is, I think, very much missing today in the academy and in our contemporary discourse. The question about arguments is not whether they work at the level of argument. It's about whether they actually motivate people to do things. Because if they don't motivate people to do things, it doesn't matter how convincing they might be according to some formal logical theory.
It's kind of related to that in a way, though it won't be a very well-formed question, I think. But, I mean, slightly pushing on that, what do you think of, I think this is kind of an idea that, like, maybe it was bigger, like 5 years ago with, like, Mark Fisher and, like, a lot of this, like, left accelerationist camp of, the power of kind of, talking about like these ideological projects, bringing them to the forefront so that the Overton window is like forced to kind of grow as people are exposed to them, and then instilling them in kind of institutions which have kind of this like native trust to a lot of people in the current society. So the idea would be, I think a lot of like the new left and like, people who really like Adorno, I think, kind of fell into this very anarchist way of thinking, which is very much about like the individual and convincing them and like, instilling these values of, liberty and all this stuff. But the idea of like taking these ideologies, making them kind of the project of institutions, which then invite people to join. And so I think the parallel to like your talk would be, you could think of the university system as like an institution that people kind of willingly join and then leave with an ideology. And so do you think, like, not a well-formed question, but like using ideology, kind of, understanding what it is and like its limits, and then trying to kind of instill new ideologies over like a longer period of time?
Yeah, I think a lot of people who have thought in terms of the Overton window have operated on the premise that if they bring something into the discussion and distribute it, that itself will shift a kind of median or mean point in the conversation toward them. And for some of these people, this means that you could say almost anything, no matter how ridiculous, and it will shift somehow the conversation in your direction because it will weight the conversation in such a way that the median point is closer to your position. I think for one, it relies on a very binary understanding of discourse, where there's the right and there's the left, and you say left-wing things and then it tilts this way, or you say right-wing things and then it tilts that way. I don't think it's so binary as all of that. There's too much disagreement about what matters for it to have that kind of character. And then also, there are a lot of things you can say that backfire, that actually repel and repulse people, especially people who are quite different from you and think in quite different ways. So I think many of these people have struggled to grapple with the degree to which the things they say are actively alienating and not helpful. And some of them have found ways to excuse that by making demographic arguments. Particularly many in the New Left operated from the premise that there was going to continue to be very high rates of economic growth of the kind that we saw in the 50s and 60s. And when that didn't materialize, then that meant that the processes of change that they observed in the 50s and 60s did not continue, or did not continue at anything like the rate at which they previously operated. So it might have been possible for people in the 50s or 60s to imagine that everyone would go to university and that this would produce a universal subjectivity, or much more closely approximating a universal subjectivity. But when the growth fell off in the 70s, in the first oil shock of 73, 74, and then again in the second of 79, 80, and the growth rates in the 80s and 90s never quite returned to those post-war levels. And then post-2008, growth and development have been very, very slow. And now there's all sorts of big existential questions about climate change and limits to planetary growth that people are concerned about. It's become much harder to tell a story in which everyone will go to university, everyone will get this constitution, and therefore if you can get the university system to produce a particular way of thinking, that this will in and of itself be radical or transformative.
Do people from the room have questions?
So you brought up a concept of a new order. And so my question is, and maybe it's not going to be super well formulated here, but is a new order not just like a reset ideology that throws you back towards full legitimacy, and won't it just continue forever? Or has there ever been can we break free of ideology at all? That's basically my question.
So I think to get completely outside of ideology, we would have to also get completely outside of the need for legitimation. And I think the need for legitimation comes from the intractable disagreement. Now, that intractable disagreement is driven by a few different things. One, which I mentioned in the talk, is the separation of persons, the fact that we are in different bodies, and so if I eat a sandwich, you're not nourished by it. Or if I'm the coolest kid in class and I'm voted prom king, you also cannot be voted prom king. Only one of us gets that particular reward. So there's separation of persons, and then related to that, an appearance of scarcity because of this separation. It seems as if when I get something, you don't get it, because it seems as if I am different from you because we're in these different bodies. And then also we have some level of ability to hurt each other. If I'm angry about the fact that you were voted prom king and I wasn't, I could egg your house, or I could meet you outside after the prom is over and try to get into a fight with you. So these different kinds of factors have tended to make it necessary for intractable disagreements to be resolved in some way, rather than simply left open or allowed to persist indefinitely. And in a way, lack of any kind of formal resolution to the disagreement is an attempt to avoid the kind of political decisions that would need to be legitimated or that would require an ideological carapace to sustain. But this involves treating everything that currently exists as a default, as a normal. And this is perhaps why Geuss was motivated to speak in terms of a seeming objectivity or a seeming neutrality or naturalness to something which actually serves particular ends and particular purposes. I'm not going to say absolutely never, but I think that these causes of intractable disagreement would have to be in some way dealt with by future people. And not just one of them, but probably at least two, if not all three of those things I just laid out. However, if you could get rid of one of them to a substantial degree, it would diminish the need for this considerably. For instance, if you were to create an environment of a superabundance of housing, food, access to health care, I think that these things would diminish to some degree the need for politicking about certain kinds of questions. But that wouldn't necessarily get rid of it. And at one point, Adorno says that one of the things that is ideological is itself the promise to end contradiction. So in some ways, it's ideological to promise to get rid of the kinds of disagreements that produce a need for ideology, to pledge to get rid of them. But that doesn't mean that we can't make things better in various ways if we're able to take any of our values seriously. If ideology critique has not completely rotted our commitment to any of our values, then we remain able to judge whether this order is at least a step in the right direction relative to some other order. But if we have so completely internalized ideology critique that we treat all of our values as the product of power systems, and we think any time that we think in terms of any value that we are being somebody's servant, then we become scared of our own minds and paralyzed by that. Sorry, I'm struggling to understand that.
I can read out the question. It says, can Foucault, I assume Monsieur Foucault, be thought to be of that camp? The camp that all of our beliefs are products of power systems.
I think certainly many people who have been influenced by Foucault would be part of that camp. Whether Foucault himself agrees precisely with the way in which he's been taken up, and maybe there are different ways of reading or engaging with him that would not be reducible to that, but certainly there have been some people who have taken Foucault in that direction. And I do think that if you take Foucault in that direction, it leads to a cul-de-sac.
For many thinkers, and I'm thinking of Immanuel Kant here in particular, this idea of like these kind of intractable disagreements is something that is historicized, right? That ultimately the system kind of plays itself out or could play itself out to some end. So in Kant's imaginary, right, you have this kind of a society based on commerce that develops, and then eventually that, right, you have a world system of competing states, but then that could resolve itself, and eventually you end up with what he describes as like the built house, where these intractable disagreements kind of historically play themselves out. Now this is much more complicated for Marx, but ultimately there is still this hope that within the system itself, even in its contradiction, that it could lead to a world, that he describes as a stateless, classless, moneyless society. In specifically that the need for violence, right? Lenin specifically raises this, the state of revolution, but the need for violence would dissipate, that intractable disagreements will eventually resolve themselves, not just through a revolution immediately, but in the process of building communism, or for Kant, the liberal society he is thinking of. That the intractability of the disagreements are historical, and that could be historically worked through. So I know you raised the relief of intractability, at least to some extent, but something like the separation of persons is not being proposed, at least by these thinkers, as something that could be resolved. And if that is a concept, if that is a cause of intractability, and thus in relation to the third category, right, violence, which is one of the forms of intractability that these thinkers, Kant, Marx, Lenin, are thinking about, was being resolved in it. How or should intractability be understood as a historical category?
So I certainly think that the intensity of intractable disagreements, the frequency of them, is historically mobile. There are times when there's incredibly intense scarcity, and as a consequence of that, there tends to be more intractable disagreements. They become harder to manage, and this tends to lead to more violence. And there are other periods where that scarcity is relieved in various ways, and you get less intense intractability, and so a greater level to have trade and prosperity. And certainly in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, many theorists had the view that this trade and prosperity had in some way eclipsed the need for force or violence, and that this eclipsing could become ever more complete and total to the point at which there would be very, very little need for any of it at all. I think a lot of this depends on what we think of language, and whether we agree with Habermas or Geuss about language. To what degree can we talk through the disagreements that come from being in separate bodies and therefore only able to reach each other with language? Some people think that we can do a lot with language, that we can do so much with language that getting the words right and having the right kind of argument and the right kind of discussion in the right kind of format would itself give rise to the right kinds of actions and ways of living. But there are other theorists that are more pessimistic about that possibility. They think that language is more difficult. And in general, since Wittgenstein, theorists have tended toward the view that language is more difficult. But that may in part be because of the spread of this over that previous period as a historical fact. So I try to leave it open. I am not absolutely sure that language will continue to be such a difficult source of intractability in the future. I believe it can be at least diminished substantially relative to now. There have certainly been times in human history where language was less of a serious cause of disagreement, where there was a greater level of shared norms and a greater level of shared understanding of what someone might mean by a word. But I also would not take that for granted, and I would not necessarily take it so far as to assert that we can completely eliminate intractable disagreement. It would feel presumptuous for me as just one person in 2025 to be sure about either of those things. And it would seem to me to be maybe a way of comforting myself if I were to take too sure a stance in either direction.
Do we have questions from the room? If not, I can go. Oh, yes, okay. We do have 2 questions from the online audience. I'll wait for you to give your question. question reads, do you think that consumerism shapes our current condition vis-a-vis intractable disagreements and ideology?
I think that the way that we live has allowed us often to avoid dealing with intractable disagreements in many areas of life. We are able to build up environments for us that isolate us to a large degree from intractable disagreement. So when we then are in situations where we confront it, we are not very well practiced in dealing with it. This is where some of this discussion about the digital and about the internet, I think, would play a significant role. The fact that you increasingly can buy large amounts of stuff without even going out in public or interacting with very large numbers of people. If you go to a grocery store, you go through a self-checkout machine, you don't talk to people. I think that the ease of consumption, which has been very much prioritized, has created a situation where you very rarely have any impediment to getting what you want, that would rely on you being able to persuade the person that you're with that you should have it. And so people do become, I think, very under-practiced. If the only constraint on what you can get is money, and if you can get money without developing these kinds of skills or capacities, then, yeah.
Do we have other questions from the room?
Trying to think about the way that this kind of like has been bubbled off, maybe. Well, one, I know that you might not want to use the word. I'm thinking of this as utopia, but these alternative visions that'll maybe not just dogmatic abstractions, as Marx called them, but these kind of utopian visions or these alternative ideas, these alternative legitimation stories, perhaps. How do we think that they are being developed or could be developed within this kind of fragmented space? And secondly, back on the question of language, how would they deal with this question of the nature of language, whether a more kind of optimistic view that of, say, Habermas versus Geuss's kind of Wittgenstein-like language games pessimism? So how would that, trying to think about how the fragmentation that already exists is shaping these utopias or legitimation stories. And then secondly, whether those would themselves become intractable over this question of Habermas versus Geuss, so to speak. The question of how intractability could work. Because like in the stories I gave, there was an assumption that things can become tractable through language, right? But ultimately, society kind of self-regulate, as opposed to this kind of more pessimistic view of Geuss.
Yeah, so I think that, for one, as critical theory and ideology critique have become dominant paradigms in universities, universities have struggled to produce legitimating abstractions or conceptualizations of abstractions that can actually take. In part because people in the university system, as soon as they propose anything constructive, are immediately set upon by arguments which are informed by all of these positions. So I think oftentimes the university has become a conservative force because it knows how to negate things and to pick them apart, but not how to propose anything of its own. And this has caused a university which appears very radical on one level to be in practice very conservative on another level. This leaves people who don't go to university to develop visions of what they would like to see happen. And I think we have tended to see in recent years more of the visions driven by people with focuses on peace, prosperity, and order especially, and then also certain notions of representation that are to do with the symbolic, that are to do with the nation or the people. But to a much greater degree than that, I think that's overplayed, and it's overplayed in part because it's the concept that's the most relevant from the university point of view. I think to a much greater degree, the focus has been on peace, prosperity, and order. Particularly post-2008, I think there's a quite strong feeling on the part of people who don't go to the university system that we don't have enough prosperity and that this lack of prosperity has produced disorder. And so a search for someone who can generate prosperity by whatever means, and in doing that maintain order, has become very paramount. There was a second part to that question that I didn't fully address that was to do with language. Can you recapitulate?
Yeah, it was kind of an overly complicated question, unfortunately, sorry.
It's just that it had two parts, so
Yeah, so trying to think about then how these are being constructed. If they were to say grow, if they were to, I mean, in this case, in the non-college educated case, has spread fairly widely, actually, and has not just become like some individual system. But in terms of the construction of these, could an intractability develop, or do you think an intractability would develop between the types of thoughts that kind of resemble the Kantian vision, right? This kind of idea of a society in which communication can reach such a level that the intractability of disputes falls out almost, or in his view entirely, versus, right, which was held by many of these famous thinkers, versus this kind of more pessimistic assumption. Because if these assumptions are being taken into these systems, that seems like a very large difference.
well, we do see, I think, substantial disagreements within the academy between critical theorists and theorists who are still committed to some kind of liberal deliberation. So, for instance, the kind of Habermas camp in the academy still thinks that it's possible to construct the kind of deliberation in which we could get the kinds of outcomes that they think are better. But they think that to do this, there will need to be state interventions to make the deliberation right. So at this point, the Habermasians have begun to argue for state management of the discourse, just as they previously argued in the 70s for state management of the economy. And there is some openness to the possibility that down the line the management could self-contradict in a way which could be radical or revolutionary. But nevertheless, there is a quite strong willingness on the part of the partisans of Habermas, whom I was recently among. I was recently at Frankfurt, at Goethe, and listened to many of the arguments that people in that camp make. And their general tenor is that there needs to be legal interventions made in Germany to protect German discourse from an Anglophone discourse that has become indifferent to truth and barbarized and no longer capable of moving toward any kind of positive outcome. And the way to do this is to use the law to stop the Anglophone discourse from influencing German society. Conversely, those who are in this other camp think that, Geuss, for instance, takes the view that this is just something that happens, and that the Habermasians, in insisting that this can be overcome with language, have enabled it by failing to recognize that it requires much more concrete interventions in the built life of people, that it requires actual changes in European society, in the ways in which Europeans interact in their institutions. It can't simply be done at the level of discourse, and it can't simply be done by introducing new discursive spaces, say citizens' juries or participatory deliberative arrangements. It would require much more deep change. But then the question is, how do you generate support for that deep change? Well, you would seem to need, I think, something more positive to say.
We do have a question from the audience. It reads, perhaps this is too specialized, but can Norman Finkelstein's quote-unquote stance be characterized as an ideology? He's a very flexible thinker and perhaps doesn't have one single ideology.
Yeah, certainly from the point of view of, if you're operating from the point of view of disagreement with Finkelstein, then Finkelstein's position could certainly be framed as ideological. Certainly it could. Yeah.
Do we have more questions from all of you?
I think at one point you specifically mentioned U.S. and the U.K. I mean, there, talk about German. Do you think, is there a part of, the world or, I guess like democracies, however we define that you think is on or less touched by this problem than like the U.S. is?
Yeah, great question. So I think this has to do with the longevity of the system, not necessarily its quality. So in the past, there have been other democratic theorists who have used language like embedded democracy to refer to a democracy that has certain objective institutional features that they think protect it. But in my case, it's much more subjective. It's to do with the attitude to democracy that is developed over a long period of time and a place. So it's not to affirm necessarily any of the procedures that exist in the countries that have this character. Indeed, they have a very specific, serious problem because they are this way. They're protected to some degree from revolution, but the cost of this is that they have spiraling disagreement that locks them up and makes it hard for them to act or to do anything. So I think it most likely applies to states that have had liberal democracy, competitive multi-party elections with the market playing a substantial role in the economy for 100 years or more. I think it's very, very likely that any state that fits this description would be subject to this. Particularly states in the Anglosphere that are subject to the discussion that occurs in the very oldest democracies. I think exposure to the Anglo discussion does tend to produce something more like this. And I think the Habermasians have a point about that. But states that became democracies more recently, say after World War II, I'm not as convinced. Or states that have changed very radically the form of their democracy, say France, in going from an old monarchy to the First Republic, to the First Empire, to the restoration of the monarchy, and then the Orleanists, and then the Second Republic, and then the Second Empire, and then the Third Republic, and then the Vichy regime, and then the Fourth, and then the Fifth. This is a state which has changed its regime very radically at some intervals, so it's not as likely that it would apply to it. And therefore, in French politics, sharp disagreement is more likely to have this appearance of being potentially revolutionary and to provoke the kinds of responses that we would have seen in the past in other places. Especially democracies that have been created in the last 30 or 40 years, say since the end of the Cold War, Poland, Hungary. These are states that don't have any deeply rooted tradition of this, aren't convinced that democracy is the reason they're prosperous, might, and with some good reason, think that the real source of their prosperity is their relationship to the European Union or NATO, that their participation in the WTO and in a set of commercial agreements is the real reason they're prosperous and stable, might not be that thickly committed to democracy. So that's how I would kind of sort it. There are cases where I'm going, yes, definitely, those 100-year-old plus democracies, maybe those since World War II, and then probably not those since 1992.
Are there more questions from the audience? Okay. Let's go to a question from the online audience. Did parties serve 19th and 20th century socialists as legitimating institutions? Could we build new institutions which can legitimate socialism through social organizing / social action?
Yes, parties definitely perform that function. There are lots of what I call in the book mediating organizations that develop or conceptualize legitimation stories or ideological critiques. And they can do both things. And they can switch which ones they're doing depending on how those organizations orient themselves toward the order at any given time. So certainly the view in the past was that certain kinds of organizations, say labor unions or socialist parties, were radical mechanisms that created new forms of legitimation stories that could then be used to evaluate what the state was doing. And organizations of that type certainly do play a role. The same goes for churches, same goes for a lot of different types of organizations. The question is whether those organizations can be sufficient, I think. To take the question somewhere where it gets difficult. Can those organizations be sufficient? I think that when you have this very sharp difference between the college-educated part of the population and the non-college-educated part, the labor unions and the party organizations that develop tend to gravitate toward one of these or the other and to become inhospitable, even hostile to the other, such that the other is regarded as potentially right-wing or fascist or totalitarian in some way, shape, or form. And so one consequence of this is that there's been a breakdown in solidarity between party organizations and labor organizations affiliated with college-educated sectors and those affiliated with non-college sectors. That's become a major problem that is quite difficult to bridge. And it's not clear to me that organizations have an effective strategy for bridging them. Many are just waiting for something to change demographically, for either the rest of the population to become college educated or for the universities to fall into crisis, decline, and for much larger numbers of people to not attend them. And many people seem content to wait for one of those things to happen without really trying to establish solidarity or social relations across that split.
Are there other questions from all you in the room?
Well, this is directly with what you just said. I guess, maybe the question there is, you talk about this like problem of getting the legitimacy because of these disagreements between like almost different sects of the same like ideological current. I think at UVA, I think we even have some of that in our union that's trying to form. But do you think there's any value to, kind of part of the ideology of this, that idea of like, we have to like convince these people and come together. But there's sometimes like a critical mass of like, the left is afraid to grab power. And the biggest legitimating forces, say, of like the Republican and Democratic parties versus like the Green Party is they have power. And like there's people who identify with them and have positions that might kind of like have internal, it might seem like it doesn't work together, but it does because at the end they are in power. And so I guess the question is, the big problem I think that you can look at with the Socialist Party of like, the 20s is it lost. And so, modernly, if we think of something that builds to the same state but manages to grab power, suddenly there is not the same legitimacy crisis, or maybe there's one like of the way the other ones are. So I guess the question is there any way that changing the internal ideology, like thinking of the material of like, one thing could be like thinking of, I think for the question like social movements, a lot of times like this idea of like the horizontal idea of like everyone kind of comes to an agreement in the party and then we all convince everyone else to have that same thing we came to an agreement with. But instead there's this idea of, this is a party that stands for this and we want to seize power and that's our main objective, which can kind of like go towards one, specific arm. Is there any hope that that could kind of like smash through what I would say is like an impasse there?
I think when you go for power, but you don't have any particular notion of what it is that you are committed to doing, because you don't have any abstract values, then if you do get power and you're then faced with the need to do something, you'll find that none of you agree about what to do, and then you'll lapse back into the same situation you were in before. Indeed, it can really blow up very badly. You can fall into all kinds of infighting once you actually get power, and this can result in the whole thing very, very quickly coming apart. A great example would be Syriza, which worked very hard to win the election in Greece back in the 10s during the Euro crisis, and then got to a stage in the negotiations with the Troika where there were major disagreements within the party about how to proceed. There was no way of resolving those disagreements, and so the party fragmented and was unable ultimately to sustain the government. So I do think that there is some need for some commitments. The difficulty is in finding commitments that can be adequate as a basis for action, but are not so all-encompassing that they demand total agreement on a worldview. What a lot of parties do is they try to establish a worldview. A lot of sects, a lot of socialist groups, they try to establish agreement on a worldview, and then they try to look for ways to apply the worldview. And the worldview is much too specific to be persuasive to any kind of large audience of people. You need something more pluralist than that. And so I think if you have agreement on, say, a demand, people might come to that demand from a lot of different points of view. You might want something like Medicare for all for many different kinds of reasons. But nonetheless, that demand might have some unifying character, and then because it's a specific, clear thing, you could either do it or not do it, and it would be easy to evaluate whether you had, provided that you're able to keep its meaning clear. If you noticed, as that demand became the central demand on the left, the response from those who did not want to do Medicare for all was to try to create confusion about what it meant. They started to throw out lots of different versions of what was ostensibly it. And so then the struggle became to clarify, this is it and not those things. That's one of these struggles that you get as you actually move toward potentially doing something. People will try to break it into different things and create different camps or different factions or constituencies within it. And this is why the demand has to be clear enough. It has to be very difficult to subject to this. At the very least, it has to be very easy to criticize efforts to do that with it. And because many have become focused on establishing agreement on a worldview rather than picking out a demand, it's become very difficult to work across the disagreement.
Are there other questions from the room? I'll read the second question from the internet. Okay. How do we identify what is ideology and what is not? What are Marxists fighting for when we cannot even go beyond ideology?
Well, I think that to say what is ideology and what is not would be to put it a little strong. Rather, the move is to be okay with the fact that the things that you value will appear to some people, and even to yourself sometimes, as maybe ideological. Even the things that we care about, they might have been produced in us by other institutions. They might have been produced in us by our parents. They might have come to us in some way from the ways in which we're embedded in the state. But that doesn't mean that we have to be afraid of the things that we value and care about, or that we have to treat them as an alien force that we have to somehow try to escape in our own minds. And when we do this, we turn ourselves against ourselves. And then we often externalize this by accusing everybody around us of being ideological. Anything anybody says, we go, well, did that come from something? And this induces a kind of paranoid mentality. So what I would say is that everything that we really care about can have this ideological dimension. And it's important to remember that, because this does allow you to take a step back from what you think and to reconsider whether it really is what you should affirm. But if you simply take that point of view, if you simply adopt the position of ideology critique and apply that, if you do the ruthless criticism of all that exists, you get to a point where you can't act anymore and where you don't even trust yourself, let alone anybody else. So I would say the focus that we've had on trying to say what isn't ideology, what is beyond this problem, has been paralyzing and has been the wrong focus. So I think it's a good question, but precisely because it's the wrong one.
Do we have more questions from the room? I'll take the opportunity to ask one of my questions, which is that recently one of the national co-chairs of the Democratic Socialists of America visited the local chapter here and said, paraphrasing Lenin, that so long as one possessed the proper revolutionary theory of politics, one could be confident in their attempts to fundamentally transform society. What do you make of the continued purchase of the Russian Revolution of 1917 as a moment of beginning to address the question of the emancipation of humanity?
Continued purchase. How wide do we mean continued purchase? Who?
I mean, for example, there's like a sect forming in the graduate union.
I mean, some people are attracted to lots of different historical moments and periods for inspiration. And I think that people should be able to draw inspiration from lots of different historical moments or periods. There are lots of different periods that if we spend some time thinking about them, they help us arrive at other ways of understanding what might be valuable to us. Get us outside of our own box, the set of stuff that's available to us in our own context. And certainly for a lot of the fellow travelers of Geuss in the Cambridge School, going back and looking at Greek and Roman thought was very helpful in coming up with new ways of understanding concepts like liberty or concepts like equality. And the same can be true for the more recent past. It can be true for the Soviet Union. It can be true for the Bolsheviks. It can be true for the liberal theorists of the 18th and 19th centuries. But I think that no one historical period should be fetishized or held as more important than all the others. Rather, all of these moments are useful for us to take a look at. They all help us to take a step back from our own situations. Sometimes people get too caught up in historical thinking. One of the things that really improved me as a thinker was a meeting I had with my supervisor, David Runciman at Cambridge, where I was telling him about how I thought the post-2008 crisis was a bit like the early 20th century. And he said to me, well, it's all well and good to say what it might be like, but you haven't done the analogy until you also say how things are now different and what has changed. If you don't do that too, then the analogy just becomes a way of trying to live in the past or to pretend that you're in a different situation. And then you start to think that by studying history, you're coming to know your present moment. But that's not true. The only way to learn about the present moment is to look at it. As uncomfortable as that may be, given how separated we are socially from people who don't spend time in the same institutions that we do.
Do we have other questions from the room?
Yes. It feels like I'm asking a lot of questions, but I mean, within the context of this and thinking about taking up the past or the present as a potential legitimate, forceful, and emancipatory politics, it seems to me, and I could be wrong, that the Habermas-Geuss conflict is still being reproduced in that. So, for instance, when you were talking about, we have all, what is ideology? What elements of Othello ideology? That's the wrong question. When thinking through that, that does still sound like Habermas and especially critical theorists' impulse to try to look at these things immanently, but trying to think through how do we get through this on the lines of itself, right? So in his case, how do we get to the realization of democracy through democracy, and past democracy through democracy? How do we get, for Lenin and Marx, how do we get past bourgeois social relations through bourgeois social relations? That seems to be the impulse there. Preventing the Geussian trying to look at the past, trying to take all these moments as equal. It seems to me like that is trying to somehow get outside of this kind of, instead of this immanent impulse, it's like this kind of like, it's still within history, right? It's not trying to escape history completely, but it's this kind of like attempt to do something new and different, albeit through taking up the past, in a way that strikes me as different than this kind of Habermas. This Habermasian impulse to try to like walk through the values we already have.
I would say that one of the things that we do imminently is engage with history and engage with many other different thought from different times, different places. This is something that the liberal thinkers themselves did. Theorists like Rousseau and Smith and Marx could read Latin and read many classical texts in Latin and took inspiration from them to critique the kinds of structures that they were in. Now, they often changed the terms that they took up in various ways, but they certainly were interested in the past and inspired by that past. In much the same way, Platypus often takes up those thinkers and uses them for inspiration to try to get out from under what it takes to be a context in which that kind of thought has been lost or has become less accessible. This is something that is itself part of what we do. Part of what we do eminently is look at the past and try to use it to get new ideas. So I wouldn't say that thinking about history is necessarily anachronistic. Part of what attracts us to particular things about history is the continuing relevance, just as the argument is often made in Platypus that the attraction of people to 1917 is evidence of a continuing relevance. The same is also true for other periods of history and other times and places. This gets back to the point about all of these things are potential inspiration points for us. But we do have to think critically anytime we draw an analogy about what has changed since then. We can't simply make an analogy and go, look, it's just like ancient Athens. That wouldn't be any better or any different from going, look, it's just like 1917.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't trying to get at like, oh, we shouldn't use history. Yeah, I do not think that. But more of this question of, it seems like there still is like a Habermas, Adorno approach to this that is trying to think about how it relates to, say, current social relations. Well, maybe a thinker like Adam Smith might actually have more purchase than somebody like Plato, or somebody like Marx, as somebody who's thinking through the crisis, would have more purchase than somebody like Plato. This is not to say Plato has no purchase on that, but it would be in relation to the social relations versus what it, and I haven't read Geuss, but this kind of impulse about like we're trying to take up ancient conceptions of liberty to try to like transvaluate liberty, to try to like modify that definition within, of course, still eminently. We cannot escape from out of society, and definitely trying to take history as the opposite of that. It still seems like there's a real difference there that I'm having trouble kind of parsing through.
I would say that medieval thinkers could have made the same arguments about the bourgeois liberals. They could have said, why are you looking at Plato and Aristotle and Cicero and those guys? Why aren't you looking at Thomas Aquinas? Why aren't you looking at John Duns Scotus? Why aren't you taking up the figures that have much more proximate relation to you historically? Why aren't you interested in the medieval church? Why do you think that you need to go all the way back to the pagans to be able to say things about now? You know, all of those same kinds of arguments were made by reactionaries during that period. So that's not to say that you couldn't have done something interesting by taking up some of those medieval touchstones. There were thinkers in the Middle Ages who were vibrant and interesting. People like Marsilius of Padua, for instance, has a lot of vibrancy for the left and for radical thinkers in all kinds of ways. But you see my point? This is something that can always be done. You can always say these people are licit and these people aren't on the basis of epochal differences, where you make kind of very hard claims about which time periods are relevant and which aren't. And I do think that this fences us in a bit.
Which is not what I'm trying to do.
No, of course not.
But yeah, I mean, just trying to think about the question of how to think about these thoughts of Plato, for instance.
But if we were to say, like, Smith is more relevant than Plato because Smith is closer to us, in the same way, arguing with a bourgeois liberal, I could say Aquinas is more relevant because Aquinas is closer to us.
Or maybe more accurately, I said Adorno would probably say that, as opposed to... But I mean, I do think it's true. Like,
Adorno also was someone who read a lot of ancient theorists.
Well, yes, and I think that that's good. Yeah, I think that that's good. It's just a question of like how to relate them does still strike me as different in, say, Adorno, in relation to the social relations.
Well, I think one of the things that has made it more difficult for people in the universities to come up with visions of the future is the degree to which many theorists from the past have become regarded as necessarily reactionary or conservative. They've been kind of surrendered as touchstones. And this surrendering of thinkers as touchstones neglects that these thinkers were themselves major parts of the bringing up of the thinkers that are still left that people like. Although lately, I mean, some people are completely even opposed to Western Marxists. They think that Western Marxists are necessarily imperialists who are part of a bad time in history and therefore aren't to be touched, aren't to be played with. And if we do that, we'll very quickly get to a point where many, many more periods of history become second class. And I think that there is a certain temporal prejudice that often occurs on the left, a tendency to regard certain time periods as less good, inferior, in ways that mean that you can't take up the thinkers. That's not to say that certain kinds of political order or certain kinds of regimes or certain levels of economic development might not be said to be better or worse than others. It's not an argument for relativism. But it is, I think, an argument for the continuing relevance of reading people, even if they might seem to us to be from very different times and places.
And we can at least agree that people should read Plato, should read Aristotle, etc.
Yeah.
I mean, I think this relates to both of their questions and statements, but because when you brought up the liminal part, you had to put in this like this kind of warning, like, oh, these are people who unironically, not memeing, like, are advocating for these things. And to me, that's like neat because so much of like, especially like left discourse is like built around people, I'd say like, cosplaying as Stalinists or something, where like on the personal ideological level, they don't want that, just like simply like they'd rather live in like a liberal democracy, but they talk about things very ideologically, very dogmatically, in a way that not just that they're informed by like historical thinkers, but they've like are just absorbing these positions of what they think like the purist ideology thinkers have had. And to me, that's somewhat been accentuated by like internet discourse. And so do you think that complicates how, right, like you even say like, some people think all these like Western Marxists are racist, which I think there's surely some people in the academy who think that. I think a lot of that has also been pushed by like just like discourse that isn't people seriously engaging with like the left project. It's just people talking. So do you think there's any difference now versus like then in terms of like we're thinking of like, great thinkers from 50 years ago and how they engage with the past versus like what this kind of zeitgeist of like the left now is talking about? And it feels different when people talk about the past or talk about the Bolsheviks. They're not analyzing it, they're just taking on like a persona.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think we also see it on the right. I think many people on the right have taken up a kind of fascist aesthetic, in part for the same reasons that people adopt Stalinism. They go, well, if they're going to call me a communist anyway, then I'll own the term and make it mean what I want it to mean and convince people on the basis of that. So even when these people adopt the term, they don't necessarily mean it in the way in which it would have historically been meant. I think that's certainly true and certainly something that goes on both the left and the right. It's difficult in countries like Germany, where many kinds of political speech are actually illegal, to make these same claims with the same level of confidence, because in these countries, the only way in which you could be a fascist in public would be to adopt some kind of ironic pose that would give you plausible deniability. Whereas in the United States or the UK or some of these other places, it would be possible to be unironically these things and to talk unironically in this way and to nonetheless participate in public discourse. There was another part of your question, which was to do with these guys and whether they also thought in a similar kind of way at previous points. I think that most of these guys, certainly Adorno, read and took very seriously a lot of old stuff that many of his students or his students' students or his students' 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 students, as we get further and further away, have not taken up to the same degree. And I do think that that is something that has been an unintended consequence of ideology critique and critical theory. I don't think it's something that Adorno would be pleased about at all. But I do think it is something that has happened. And it's something that we have to work through as intellectuals, at least, insofar as we're thinking in those terms.
It is getting up on 9 p.m. Do we have any other questions from the room? I think we'll leave it at that. Thank you for giving us this presentation and for taking questions from all of us. And we'll end the stream right here.